And today on the show, we are looking at exactly that kind of collision.
Oh, big time.
We're examining Pastor Roddy Williams' sermon, The Widow Who Built a Business. It's an interpretation of the biblical narrative found in 2 Kings chapter 4, but it reads the text entirely through the lens of modern entrepreneurship and, well, economic theory.
And, to set the stage for anyone who hasn't read 2 Kings 4 recently, this is a text about a widow in absolutely desperate, terrifying circumstances. In the ancient Near East, there was no bankruptcy protection.
Right, none at all.
She is facing the immediate reality of her 2 sons being taken into debt slavery by creditors, and the prophet Elisha instructs her to go to her neighbors, gather as many empty jars as she can, go inside her house, and pour the tiny singular flask of oil she has left into them.
Just one little flask.
Right, and miraculously, the oil doesn't stop flowing until every single borrowed jar is full. Elisha then tells her to sell the oil, pay her debts, and live on the rest. Now, our disagreement today isn't about the historical events of the story. It's about the mechanism of Pastor Williams' interpretation.
Exactly. Because my view is that Williams' sermon is a profound, pragmatic theological synthesis. He brilliantly bridges faith and practical action, and he essentially argues that divine intervention actually requires our active preparation, our systems, and our economic responsibility.
Yeah, and I come at it from a very different way.
I know you do.
Because by emphasizing business capacity and market dynamics, the sermon risks entirely shifting the locus of the miracle. It moves the focus away from God's unmerited grace, which is the core concept of a gift that cannot be earned, and places the burden of salvation squarely on the shoulders of human entrepreneurial hustle.
Well, let's really unpack what Williams is doing here, because I think he is fundamentally reorienting how people read a miracle narrative, and doing so for the better. The traditional reading often leaves the widow as a passive victim. She is marginalized, she is waiting for a handout, she is hoping heaven just drops a solution in her lap. But Williams reclaims her as a model of active stewardship. His core thesis is laid out immediately. God doesn't just perform miracles, he develops entrepreneurs.
Which is quite a claim.
It is. He zeroes in on Elisha, asking her, "What do you have in your house?" She says she has nothing but a little oil. And Williams points out that every business begins with inventory. God didn't start with what she was missing. He started with the dormant capital she already possessed.
Right.
It's a really sophisticated way of explaining to a modern listener that genuine faith isn't passive waiting. It requires active participation.
Look, I absolutely understand why that reading is highly motivating. I really do. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt powerless, it is incredibly empowering to be told you aren't a victim, but a potential entrepreneur.
Exactly.
But, and this is a big but, this fundamentally over-secularizes a deeply spiritual text. When Williams interprets her borrowing of empty vessels as a mandate to increase your systems and increase your leadership, he is overlaying 21st century corporate jargon onto a visceral survival narrative.
I don't know if I'd call it jargon.
It shifts the text. It changes it from a story of a desperate, marginalized woman being saved purely by divine grace, which again is supposed to be unearned favor, and turns it into a modern business seminar. It basically tells the listener that if you want a miracle from heaven, you must first develop an entrepreneurial mindset.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because I don't think Williams is replacing grace with business acumen. He is defining the mechanism of how grace actually materializes in the physical world. Let's look at the instruction to gather jars.
Okay, let's look at it.
Elisha tells her to borrow vessels, and not just a few. Williams extrapolates this into a clear principle: increase your capacity. He says many people pray for increase while preparing for average. The tagline he uses is, God feels capacity, not complacency.
Yeah, I remember that line.
Think of it like a municipal electrical grid. God is the power plant generating the infinite miraculous charge, right? That's the oil. But human beings have to build the infrastructure. We have to lay down the copper wires, build the transformers, install the outlets. those are the vessels.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't build the systems to capture and distribute the power, the fact that the power plant possesses infinite energy doesn't light up a single house. The miracle requires human infrastructure to flow into.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go for it.
The electrical grid analogy sounds perfectly logical, but let's hijack your analogy for a second. If someone is sitting in a blackout and Williams essentially tells them it's their fault the lights are off because they didn't buy enough copper wire, he is completely ignoring the fact that they might not have the money to buy the wire in the first place.
Well,
Look at the specific language he uses. He asks the congregation, can your business handle more customers? Can your ministry handle more people? And then he drops this massive statement, heaven's abundance often stops where our preparation ends. That is a crushing theological burden to place on a believer.
but is it a burden or is it just accountability?
It's a burden because of how people internalize failure. If we take his framework strictly, it means that if someone's small business goes under, or if a church plant fails to grow, or if a family remains trapped in generational poverty, the direct implication is that they were complacent.
I think that's a bit of a stretch.
It implies they prepared for average. This entirely ignores the complex systemic realities of life. It ignores economic recessions, systemic inequality, illness. It reduces the entirety of human failure to a lack of individual preparation. It takes grace, which is defined as a gift freely given to the desperate, and turns it into a strict meritocracy based on how many vessels a person managed to hustle up.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I see the pastoral danger you're pointing out, right? Obviously, nobody wants to tell a bankrupt business owner that God didn't bless them because they didn't try hard enough.
Exactly.
But I think you are stripping the sermon of its specific psychological context. Williams isn't saying that all failure is a result of poor preparation. He is challenging the psychological posture of the believer.
How so?
He is asking them to examine whether their own internal limitations, their fear, their lack of faith, their refusal to build community relationships are the actual bottlenecks to their growth. In the biblical text, the oil genuinely was not the limitation. The jars were.
Well, yes, textually.
The moment the jars ran out, the text explicitly says the oil stopped flowing. That isn't a 21st century capitalist overlay. That is a literal textual fact. Williams is just applying that physical reality to human psychology.
But the jars running out wasn't a punishment for a lack of hustle. It was simply the completion of the exact provision needed to pay her specific debt. Framing it as heaven's abundance stopping because of our lack of preparation changes the power dynamic of the divine.
In what way?
It reduces God to a passive reactant who can only move in proportion to human ambition. And this focus on human action brings me to how Williams outlines the actual manifestation of the miracle. He introduces this acronym, right? POUR.
Yes, POUR. Prepare, obey, use what you have, repeat.
Right.
And this is where I think the sermon finds its strongest footing. Williams points out a beautiful mechanical reality of the text. God didn't pour the oil, the widow did.
Mm-hmm.
The miracle happened while she was pouring. It didn't happen in a sudden flash of lightning where the jars magically filled themselves. It happened in the repetitive, mundane, exhausting action of filling jar after jar.
Okay, sure.
He uses the R in POUR to stand for repeat, emphasizing that success isn't one big magical moment. It is faithful consistency. He explicitly says, entrepreneurs don't quit after one customer. Believers don't quit after one prayer. This bridges the spiritual and the practical so well because it tells the listener that the miraculous is often hidden in the monotony of just doing the work.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the O in that very same acronym?
Obey.
Yes, the O stands for obey, and Williams himself says, obedience unlocks what logic cannot. This is exactly where the entire entrepreneurial framework begins to buckle under its own weight.
Wait, how does obedience contradict the entrepreneurial framework? Isn't executing a difficult plan a form of obedience to a vision?
Because pouring a tiny single flask of oil into dozens of empty borrowed jars behind closed doors is not a system. It is not a logical business strategy. It is an act of pure, illogical obedience to a prophet.
I mean,
When Williams says, God blesses stewardship before abundance, he is attempting to force a logical cause and effect business principle onto a narrative that is fundamentally about an illogical act of faith. A sound business strategy is doing market research, establishing a supply chain, and analyzing profit margins.
Right, but
It is not pouring an empty jar into another empty jar just because a holy man told you to. By framing her obedience as stewardship and developing systems, he's trying to have it both ways. He wants the prestige and actionable logic of a business strategy, but he still has to rely on the fundamentally illogical nature of the miraculous to make the story resolve.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I don't believe logic and obedience are mutually exclusive in the way you're presenting them.
Okay, I'm listening.
In the entrepreneurial world, there is almost always a moment where traditional logic reaches its absolute limit. Every founder reaches a point where the spreadsheet says they should quit, the market research says it won't work, but they possess a vision, a conviction that forces them to keep pouring their time, their capital, and their sweat into the venture anyway.
Yeah, but that's...
In the secular world, we call that visionary grit or founder's intuition. In the spiritual framework Williams is building, that exact same psychological mechanism is called obedience. He is translating the ancient concept of prophetic obedience into the modern concept of faithful execution despite a total lack of visible resources. When she closes the door and pours, she is executing the process.
But execution of a process implies you know the mechanism of how the result is achieved. The widow did not know how the oil was multiplying in the jar. When we insist on calling her a founder or an entrepreneur, we are demanding that she possess an agency and a strategic foresight that the text simply doesn't give her.
I think you're underestimating her.
And this reaches its absolute breaking point when the narrative moves from the generation of the oil to its distribution. I'm talking about the sell it section of Williams' sermon.
Ah, yes. The marketplace. Williams correctly notes that Elijah didn't tell her to hoard the oil, store it, or just sit around admiring it. He explicitly told her to sell it.
Right, but listen to the rhetoric Williams uses here. He declares, God transformed a miracle into a marketplace, and then he drops heavily into what I can only describe as Silicon Valley startup culture.
Oh, come on.
He does. He says, you can't sell what you don't buy. If you won't purchase your own dream, why should anyone else? He is arguing that every entrepreneur has to buy the vision, the process, and the sacrifice before the world will buy what they built.
Yes, and?
We are talking about a woman acting out of pure, unadulterated survival. She is trying to save her flesh and blood children from being chained and enslaved by creditors. To project this 21st century visionary leadership language, suggesting she needed to purchase her own dream onto a traumatized widow trying to survive the week, is a severe misreading of the text's historical tone.
She wasn't buying a vision. She was liquidating a miraculously provided asset to avoid familial destruction.
I understand the resistance to the startup terminology, I really do. But if we only view her as a traumatized victim liquidating an asset, we deny her the dignity of the transformation that the text itself outlines.
She absolutely entered the story as a victim, but she did not leave as one. The act of taking that oil and entering the marketplace is an act of profound agency. When Williams says the kingdom doesn't just create products, it creates value, he is elevating her survival into a recognized economic reality.
I just think it's too much.
And more importantly, you can't isolate the sell it section without immediately looking at the final section of his sermon, which is payback. I think this entirely undercuts your critique that he's just projecting ruthless capitalist startup culture onto her.
I'll agree that the payback section changes the tone significantly, but I don't know if it rescues the startup culture overlay we just talked about.
I would argue it redefines the entire framework. In the payback section, Williams points out the specific order Elisha gives her. First, pay your debts. Then you and your sons live on the rest. Williams explicitly states, before profit comes responsibility.
Yeah, that is a good line.
This is not a vision of a solitary, ruthless genius founder extracting wealth from a community to build a monopoly. It is a highly ethical, deeply embedded economic model. He reminds the congregation of a crucial detail. She borrowed every single vessel she used.
Right.
She had to rely on a community that trusted her. Somebody opened their house. Somebody lent what they owned to a widow who seemingly had no way to pay them back. Williams concludes this section with what I think is a brilliant encapsulation of kingdom economics. He says the kingdom isn't built by people who climb ladders and kick them away. It's built by people who become ladders for somebody else. He is taking the language of business and utilizing it to teach integrity, community obligation, and ethical responsibility.
Well, I will concede that his conclusion regarding community reliance is the strongest, most textually grounded part of the entire sermon.
Thank you.
When he tells the listener, "Never forget the hands that helped fill your house," he rightly identifies that the mechanics of the miracle were entirely dependent on the social capital the widow possessed within her community. Without her neighbors lending her those empty jars, her capacity for the oil is exactly zero.
Exactly zero.
That is a beautiful truth. I just remain deeply cautious about how we define the success that follows. When he summarizes at the very end that she walked in expecting a handout and left with a sustainable income and a business, it ties up the horrifying, messy reality of ancient poverty into a very neat, modern bow.
But isn't that exactly the primary function of a modern sermon? The goal is to take ancient, historically distant realities that are completely foreign to us, and translate them into actionable paradigms for a modern audience.
Yeah, translation is necessary, but
The listener sitting in the pews today or listening to the audio isn't facing ancient Near Eastern debt slavery, but they are facing bankruptcy. They are facing failing small businesses. They are facing a terrifying lack of resources to feed their families. By framing her as an entrepreneur, Williams gives the modern listener a bridge.
a bridge, sure.
He connects them with her agency. He moves them from sitting in despair asking God, "Why aren't you rescuing me?" to looking around and asking, "What do I already have in my house that I can put to work?"
It is certainly a powerful motivational tool, there is no denying that. To summarize my position, though, while I completely recognize the pragmatic utility of moving people to action, we have to be incredibly careful when we swap out the language of divine mystery and unmerited grace for the metrics of modern business, capacity, and visionary leadership.
Right.
If we push this framework too far, we risk teaching people that God is essentially an angel investor who only funds the founders who pitch the best systems. And that leaves the people who fail feeling abandoned, not just by the economy, but by the divine.
I hear you. And to summarize my view, I believe Williams has provided a masterful example of reading ancient texts through a lens of active faith. He doesn't discard grace at all. He simply explains the mechanics of how grace requires our physical participation. It's a theology of responsibility that rightly moves the believer from being a passive victim waiting for a handout to being an empowered steward who utilizes community, integrity, and consistent action to change their reality.
But we do both agree that the emphasis on recognizing the resources you already possess, starting with that little oil in your own house, is a profound and necessary insight.
Oh, absolutely.
And honoring the community network that makes your survival and your success possible is a universal truth, whether you choose to frame it as theology, sociology, or economics.
Without a doubt, which brings us right back to that classic car and the computer scanner we talked about at the start of the show. When we read a text through the lens of modern business, it undoubtedly highlights the mechanics of capacity, action, and community reliance in ways a purely traditional reading might miss entirely.
Yeah, it brings up new data.
But the tension remains. Does the diagnostic tool clarify the true mechanical meaning of the text, or does it simply reflect our own modern priorities back to us?
That is the big question.
The material invites all of us to continually re-examine whether our own lack of preparation is limiting our potential, or whether we are relying far too much on our own hustle instead of grace. It leaves us to decide for ourselves. Is the widow's story ultimately one of spiritual submission, entrepreneurial triumph, or somehow miraculously both?